Hello, everybody. It is so great to be here at FiRe. I'm Berit Anderson, CEO of Scout. And Scout is a company that's focused on the social implications of technology. But more than that, Scout really actually is kind of a product of FiRe, in that I have spent the last 10 to 15 years of my life attending this conference. And talking to all of you really inspired me to create this new media company, which we launched this year. So I want to just take a minute to say thank you to everyone who has supported Scout, who has inspired us in any way. And one of the ways that Scout covers the social implications of technology is that we combine near-term science fiction and technology reporting. And we do that focused on specific topics and specific dispatches at a time. And this year, or about a year ago, we launched a Kickstarter campaign. And one of the people, there was an incredible response from the science fiction community when we launched that campaign. And one of the people that reached out to us at that time was Eliot, Pepper. Eliot is an incredible guy. He's a strategist and an author. He lives in Oakland. He's written 5 novels, most recently a book called Neon Fever Dream, and Cumulus, which I want to talk a little bit more about today. Cumulus, as in Eliot's words, is a dark, gritty science fiction story set in a near-future San Francisco Bay Area, ravaged by economic inequality and persistent surveillance. So, not too far from where things are today. And TechCrunch actually called him the heir to William Gibson's throne, which I thought was pretty ballsy of them.
Yeah, really bold. Like, I don't know how I feel about that.
He's helped build numerous technology businesses. He's survived dengue fever. He's translated Virgil's Aeneid from the original Latin, worked as an entrepreneur in residence at a venture capital firm, and explored the ancient Himalayan kingdom of Mustang. So this is a guy who, how old are you?
I just turned 30.
All right, so he's one to watch. He's got a lot of stuff up and coming. So Eliot, I wanted to ask you, a lot of the science fiction authors that I know and have met have kind of this background or history, either in science, hard science and technology, or specifically in writing. And I'm wondering, you kind of moved into science fiction from the world of venture capital, correct?
Yeah, I have basically neither background. So I went to school for international relations, actually. And while I was at school and then graduate school, outside of class, I started working in startups and just sort of caught the bug and really enjoyed that experience.
So where was the transition there?
Into writing?
Yeah.
So I had been working for a venture capital firm as a drop-in operator and on financings. And one of the things that I realized while doing it is that for many of the members of this audience who have worked in or with early stage technology companies, there's a lot of natural human drama there, right? So you have really big type A personalities. You have people putting everything on the line, fortunes won and lost, potentially world-changing technology, but also a lot of empty promises. And so there's just, it's a really wonderful and rich canvas. And what I found sort of odd is that ever since I was a little kid, I've always loved reading science fiction and many other genres. And I was always surprised that there wasn't much fiction set in this weird world of Silicon Valley and startups, because it just seemed so ripe for that. But most of the literature about startups is business literature, right? So it's memoirs, lessons learned. And so when I couldn't really find that book to read,
you wrote it.
I started to write. I was like, well, why not? Give it a shot.
It's a good attitude to have, I think. So Cumulus is set in Oakland, and it focuses on a company, called Cumulus, that has this kind of universal surveillance abilities, and the impact that has on a really highly stratified, economically unequal society. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the vision that you paint of what does that look like in your fictional future? Yeah,
so in the book, you have this massive tech giant, which you can almost imagine as like every current technology company wrapped together plus 20 years. And then alongside of that, it also paints forward basically the trend that we're seeing in terms of rising economic equality in the US. So I grew up in Oakland, and I recently moved back there a few years ago. And one of the things that struck me and that really played into this novel was that the neighborhood I used to grow up in had transitioned from being sort of, I don't know, like on the edge of a sketchy neighborhood to then becoming a very wealthy neighborhood. I now no longer live there, but where I grew up, where my parents' house is, there are now private security services that patrol the streets.
And in your book, you really take that one step.
Right.
Can you describe what it is?
Right. So if you've spent time in many developing countries like that have big wealth gaps, if you've ever spent time in Brazil or in many countries in Latin America, you'll know that you have neighborhoods of really, really wealthy people that are completely separated socially from the rest of the environment. So basically gated communities writ large, and that's very much what's in the novel. So we have green zones where everything is taken care of. You know, we just saw flying cars here. There aren't flying cars in the book, but there are a lot of autonomous ones. You have really good safety, really good schools, basically everything you would want to see in an ideal neighborhood. But the flip side is, because this is essentially a company town, if you're not in the green zone, if you're outside of that, it's the Wild West, and public services and public infrastructure have degraded.
And so in this vision, I think one of the things that really struck me was Cumulus, the company, has surveillance of everything, right? So they basically have videos all over the street. They can see where you are at any time. They can track when you enter specific neighborhoods. How do you think about that playing out? How close are we to that now, and how long until we get to that?
I mean, I think we're getting there. I think that fundamentally software makes, it's so easy to track activity in software. I mean, you have logs. It's really, really easy. And because it's so easy and cheap, there's very rarely an argument not to track things, because tracking things is super useful. If you're trying to make a tool and you can use software, you can use tracking to see how well it works or where it might be improved, you're going to do that. And so most of the things that we talk about when we're thinking about almost like a dystopian version of surveillance are actually externalities of really good productive things we just do with software anyway. But because we can thank Mark Andreessen for the quote, right? Software is eating the world. As software becomes a part of pretty much every artifact we manufacture, now everything can and will be tracked. I mean, I just don't really see, it's just it's too cheap and too useful to not happen. And so I think that the interesting question for us socially is how do we govern that, right? Because suddenly, if that kind of data is ubiquitous, we have to figure out what to do about it. And that's a new kind of challenge that we haven't really needed to tackle before.
And I think another thing that I found really interesting about your book, the company portrayed in the book, the founder is very altruistic at heart. But the externalities and the ways that she executes these different visions have all of these terrible impacts. And I'm wondering if you look now at companies that are in kind of a similar position, right?
Sure.
Like companies like Google, which is founded on the principle of don't be evil.
Right.
How do you see, what are the externalities that you see playing out in the next 15 to 20 years?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that there are there are different ways to tackle that. So one thing we've talked a lot about is basically the future of technology and geopolitics, right? And yesterday, we were actually chatting about that one Google program. There's a Google program called Jigsaw that is, it is literally, it's a semi-external think tank, basically, with the explicit goal of running geopolitical experiments with technology. And the guy who runs it was sort of a somewhat controversial up-and-comer at the State Department and got recruited away, and now he runs this program. And they're doing things that sound super-duper cool, right? They're fabulous. As an example, in the news, we constantly are seeing stories about people getting trolled on social media, right? So maybe a feminist writer or a comedian who just makes some joke or makes a comment and then gets piled on with thousands of absolutely horrendous comments, right? And that's really difficult to manage. Right now, most of the social media companies are doing a fairly poor job at trying to restrict that and keep the conversation civil. And so one of the projects that this group is working on is they're building a machine learning algorithm to basically vet and edit, like automatically vet and edit for hate speech, right? And like that sounds great, right? Like, and in most cases, that would be wonderful. Like Twitter would be probably a more pleasant place to hang out, right? So, you know, that's great. But the problem is that there's a big gray area between free speech and hate speech.
Yeah.
And that is something that this kind of a solution is going to have a lot of trouble with. And if that's going to be the automatic moderator for massive amounts of human conversation where there's no human oversight, I mean, that's where things get really sticky.
Yeah, and that's something that we've covered this year a little bit too. We did an investigation and found out that at Facebook, if you have 2 engineers, you can make a change to the Facebook algorithm. Yep. Which is great because it makes things really efficient, really move quickly. But when you're in an election year and you're looking at Facebook has a demonstrated willingness to conduct social experiments on people to convince them to get out to the polls or to convince them to, they found that by showing people more favorable posts about a specific topic, they can actually change their opinion, they can change their mood. And I think when you combine that possibility of this very easy change by 2 engineers without any outside oversight, even within the company, with the possibility of like really targeted changes to that algorithm, it creates some really kind of...
Yeah, so I think that, so there are so many examples of this, and that's a good one. And, like often we've thought about the press as this, integral part of civil society that helps us keep an eye on things, right? But like now most of us consume media through Facebook. And so if those algorithms, which are not transparent, like they are a trade secret, right? Like if those algorithms remain opaque, now the public has no view into that, right? And I think that that's where things get weird. And I think that the sort of funny part is that if you really take a step back, like we can come up with dozens of examples of things like this and many other companies, not just Facebook, where you have these individual policies that have really, really great intentions behind them, but have these weird externalities that you can easily imagine coming out the back. But a lot of it comes down to the scale of internet companies. One of the beautiful things about software, from an investment perspective, from a technological perspective, from basically every perspective, is that it is so eminently scalable. Like you can have a couple of engineers build something that can touch people around the entire world.
It's the 8X effect.
Right, so like it's sexy, right? Like that's really, really cool. Who doesn't want to be able to create an impact, especially if the impact you want to create is positive? But what that results in is a winner-take-all effect, right? So like you've seen this in media for a long time. A few movies every year take home the vast majority of box office returns. I'm an author. When Harry Potter was coming out, those 7 books, they represented more than 50% of all bookstore revenue during the time the series was coming out, right? So you have this huge superstar effect. And the nature of the internet, because it's so scalable, it's changing that. It's no longer just in music and movies and books. Like that kind of an effect is moving into the infrastructure that we use every day. And Facebook is one piece of digital infrastructure. The minute that you have one company that controls that much infrastructure that many people use all the time in a way that is not transparent to users, it's very, very, very easy for science fiction writers like myself to imagine a lot of downside scenarios, right? So I think that's where we have to be careful.
So I think this is a really interesting question. It's something that's come up a little bit throughout FiRe this year as we've talked about nation-sponsored IP theft and what role companies should play in that fight versus nations.
Yeah.
And when you look at with countries like Russia, right? Russia's mounting cyber warfare against Estonia and Lithuania pretty constantly, and they're attacking their government websites. They're trying to take out internet. They're this transition and this this kind of weird space that we're in, where we still have international governance structures on the ground, but we also have this really interesting, fascinating parallel internet governance structure that's taking place with companies like, I mean, even just yesterday, Google, IBM, Facebook, a few others announced that they were taking on artificial intelligence in what was essentially kind of an extended lobbying arm, right? But they're taking on the role of informing the government about why artificial intelligence is safe, and in so doing, setting up this kind of unofficial way to self-regulate. I think
it's lobbying.
they're like prepping. They're basically prepping themselves to be able to say, here are the dangers, and here's what you should do about them, right? So, what should, I mean, just to toss you a softball here, like how should we think about that interaction between nation states and national governments and these international borderless, essentially internet nations?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the way to think about that is to understand what a nation state is, right? Like a nation state is a made-up concept that we had just all agreed to. I mean, we grew up, going to school and saying the Pledge of Allegiance, so it seems normal, but it's only a few hundred years old, right? Like human societies have not often organized themselves around the kinds of national borders that we have today. And I think that's really telling, because when the concept of the nation state became more formal, it made sense. So one of the themes of this conference, this year's FiRe conference, is flows, right? And if you went back to sort of the inception of the nation state a few hundred years ago, you would notice something really interesting. The economic and political flows at that time made sense for national boundaries, right? So it's like most economics were like a lot of the economy were bounded within those borders. Most international interaction was done via diplomats, armies, or merchants, right? So like a pretty small class of people at that time. And so when we decided what a federal government meant, and how that was different from a local government, and how that was different from an international treaty, like it made sense according to the flows of that time. Now, technology has changed that. So like we're now living in a time where the economy is global, like crime is global, right? Like the black market is 20% of global GDP. Like if that's true, like how could you police effectively if you were only doing it within your own country? The internet has made information global in like a very obvious way, right? So by breaking down those national borders, it's not that like tomorrow we're going to wake up and there aren't going to be countries, but the polity, the borders of a nation state are a membrane, and they're becoming more and more porous. And that means that the federal government is getting confused and trying to figure out how to react. And I think that there are other polities, right? So like when you look at interest-based communities and stuff like that, those borders are actually becoming harder, right? They're hardening. And when you look at international affairs, you have companies, like private companies like Google and Facebook. You just mentioned them working with the US federal government. They're also working internationally. And they're working in areas that we would typically, if we used a 20th century lens, associate with governments, right? And so there's now this blending. It's almost like if you look back to the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, where they had their own armies, right? If you think about cybersecurity today, like the cybersecurity efforts of Google and the big internet players are at least as important as what our federal government does, right? So you could almost imagine, okay, what if like GE had its own private army to make sure its assets were safe, right? So I mean, we live in a weird moment of transition there, where our regulatory and political structures haven't yet caught up with the changes we're seeing in technology and economics. And that's as it should be, right? Like regulation is by its very nature a laggard, right? Like people just start to do things, and then if we don't like them, or we feel like it's unfair, or we feel like there needs to be some rules, then we set the rules.
So what do you think that, I mean, we're clearly in a time right now of companies forging ahead and taking on some really important responsibilities. I mean, just to read from a little bit of a Wired article about Jigsaw, the Google company you mentioned, right? So Jigsaw functions as Google's blue sky, human rights-focused skunk works. At the group's launch, Schmidt declared its audacious mission to be tackling the world's toughest geopolitical problems, and listed some of the challenges within its remit: money laundering, organized crime, police brutality, human trafficking, and terrorism. Those are national responsibilities, or have been traditionally.
Right.
Where do you think, will there be a social pushback against companies coming out in this way, or will they be welcomed?
Oh, I mean, I think it's both, right? So the reason why those specific, like there are many areas that you could take, social issues you could take on, but the reason why Jigsaw chose those issues is because those specific issues are extremely borderless, right? Like they operate across borders no matter what. And so Google's looking at it and they're like, well, we do too. Like this makes sense. Like we can actually do this well, right? And I think that they're going to do some good work there. But I think that there is going to be a lot of pushback as regulators figure out that they're losing their, I mean, people who have power want to retain it. And so, I mean, you can look at just this week, we were chatting yesterday, the WTO announced that they're going to now start looking at the internet, which they have not done to date. So that's actually like a pretty big deal for them. And I think that we're going to see more governmental and intergovernmental action on internet issues, and I think that, and like specifically with those companies, right? And so I think that we're going to have a lot of fragmentation and a lot of, like, I don't think there's going to be one clear thing like, okay, in the future is going to be run by private tech giant corporations, right? Like, I think that there's going to be a balance as government tries to refigure out what its role is. But I mean, fundamentally, we are consumers, and we like to use the technologies those companies develop, but we also care about other things. We care about things like fairness, right? Which that still seems.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, you may not, but some of us do. And like those are things that that regulators actually have like a pretty legitimate role in trying to protect. So
we have just a few minutes left, and I want to just take the rest of our time while we're here today to talk about Mars. Because when we're talking about and thinking about the 20-year outlook and the extended near future, Elon released a video this week detailing his plans to colonize Mars. He expects to have someone on the ground there with it by 2025, the first man on Mars. What are the, this is an entirely new frontier, literally. There are no laws in space.
Right.
There are no laws about colonization of space. What are the ethical and legal questions that we should be considering when we look at this?
That's a good question. I mean, right now, so we've talked a lot about the ocean this week, and right now the law of the sea governs the ocean, for better or for worse. And I think that might be our best corollary for space. I mean, there may be experts here who know far more about how governments are thinking about space than I do. Yeah, I mean, I think that it'll be messy. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, given that Elon really wants to go to Mars, I think there's also going to be a bit of a first mover advantage there. I mean, if you get there and somebody doesn't like it, can they even get there to tell you that?
How will they enforce the rules?
Yeah. So I mean, so I think that the announcement this week was really interesting. So very explicitly, Elon's goals are one, why are you doing this? I'm doing this, number one, because it sounds fun, right? And that's that's a legit reason. And number two is basically, it's a hedge against Earth, right? So in an interview soon after that announcement, the examples he gave were, look, the Romans had great aqueducts, and their empire fell, right? The Egyptians had great pyramids and they forgot how to build them. The Chinese had the greatest naval fleet on the planet until they decided, the next emperor decided to just burn it and stop exploring. So I think that his goals there are basically that, right? Okay, this is far enough away that you could imagine that it could be a good hedge against if things go badly here, whether they go badly because of rising sea levels or cyber war or anything else. So I think that that's sort of, that's interesting, but that's not the most interesting part about it for me. What
is the most interesting part?
Another softball. Yeah, so I mean, I think that what really struck me, because we were chatting about this yesterday, and I was trying to think, like, okay, what's important about this? Like, if you actually go to Mars, we were chatting with Larry over wine, and it was like, it's sort of going to suck for a long time, right? You know, like, what's the best you could hope for? Like an Antarctic settlement, right? And so I don't think that's particularly exciting. But what I think is exciting is when you look at this kind of an announcement and this kind of an initiative in the context of where we've been as a country and as a world for the past couple decades. Like right now, I live in Oakland, and Silicon Valley is sort of goofy right now. It feels like the MBAs are starting to outnumber the geeks. Right? You know, we're coming through a financial crisis, and we have some of the best new minds in physics going into high-frequency trading, right? So we've been living through a political time where Congress has basically not done much for a long time, and it's very polarized political speech. And so when you see something like this, what I think is cool is that he's issuing a challenge. He's issuing us, all of us, a challenge to think beyond ourselves, to not try to, when you're a successful business person, only think about the next quarterly earnings report, right? But to actually think like, wow, this is a really ambitious project, and we're doing it for reasons that are literally fun and then like a sort of goofy, like long-term hedge, right? And I think that's really exciting, because my hope is that when you look at the scale of this, that you're like, okay, we're actually going to do this project. It really gets people excited. It challenges our own cynicism, that by going to Mars, maybe that'll actually be the inspiration we need to take care of Earth a little better.
I like that. Interspatial motivator. Okay, we have time for about one question, if anyone wants to step up.
Eliot, very cool. I just wanted to pick your brain, since you are a creative author. It's fun to do the sort of, the downsides, but like the fact that Facebook can affect behavior could also be super useful in terms of educating people for public health, educating people for anything, promoting well-being across borders. Like, what are some upshots here that you see?
Sure. So that's a great question. So yeah, I guess I'm really bullish, like on the future, on the internet, on digital media. So like one really cool example which I mentioned to you yesterday would be like, how do we think about the future of art? I actually think we're headed for an unprecedented artistic renaissance in the next few decades, and that's largely because when you look at how art was done, before a few hundred years ago, if you did visual art or music or storytelling or anything, you basically did it locally. You were doing it with the people that you met in your life. When you had the printing press, suddenly writing was able to go farther than that, right? As long as you had literacy. In the 20th century, we had broadcast media, where, okay, now as long as you get through the gatekeepers, you can actually have this very broad reach. But what broadcast media does is it also turns the people who are not through the gates more into consumers than producers, right? It's like, we're watching TV. Most people watch TV but don't make TV shows. And I think when you look at the internet today, there's a fundamental shift happening, right? Like 20,000 songs are uploaded to Spotify every day. In every single minute, there are 300 hours of video uploaded to YouTube. Amazon has made it so now there are more than 1 million books published every year. Kickstarter, of which Scout was a successful raise, has helped more than 112,000 projects, creative projects, raise money. Like basically, if you look at any format of human expression, there's this massive explosion. I mean, even when we use Twitter, right? I mean, like basically, it's turned us all into poets, and the
haiku poets.
Yeah. So actually, Twitter just arranged with the Library of Congress to have the entire history of Twitter. So every single tweet that's ever been tweeted or will be tweeted is going to be recorded there, right? So I think we're moving culturally into this weird shift where rather than being sort of this dichotomy of like creative producers and creative consumers, we're all participants. And there's this conceit in writing that literature is actually a conversation, right? That like authors, because they read each other's work, are really just contributing to a larger conversation. And I think what the internet has done is it has included almost everyone in that cultural conversation in almost every format. So I think that if you look at the next few decades, I am super, super bullish that we're going to have the best stories ever told, the best movies ever made, the best photos ever taken, the best songs ever recorded, are going to be in the next 20 years.
Especially once we lose all our jobs and we have all this extra
We have nothing
time.
else to do.
Yeah,
It's great.
It's going to be awesome.